So today we're going to be talking about children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And these children in the past were referred to as children with mental retardation, but the politically correct term now is intellectual and developmental disabilities. In the very early history, prior to the 19th century, pretty much children that had intellectual disabilities were left to perish or to die unless they could be trained, if they had more mild intellectual disabilities, unless they could be trained to farm in the agrarian societies or to some kind of trade. It was later in the 19th century with the work of Edward Seguin, who was a student of Itard's. Itard worked with Victor, who was called the Wild Boy of Aveyron. Edward Seguin brought Itard's techniques to the United States, and we were able to school actually support children and adults with intellectual disabilities at the time, and so that was more of a flourishing time. However, we also had a time of pessimism where we started to institutionalize and warehouse children with intellectual disabilities. And so the current perspective, though, is one of really rising expectations, one of more inclusion, one focusing on the abilities of all people and not their limitations. So there was shifting perspectives throughout our society at different times. The more recent court cases that have dealt with children with intellectual disabilities are those of Daniel R. and Rachel H. And as we know, court cases shape our practices of teachers. And so Daniel R. dealt with a little guy with Down syndrome, and Rachel H. dealt with again, a young child, kindergarten age at the time of the case, who had also had an intellectual disability. And these cases helped to shape least restrictive environment, one of the principles dealing with special education law, and they help to shape how we move forward with educating children with intellectual disabilities. So the idea definition of intellectual disabilities is that these are children who have below average intellectual functioning, existing concurrently or with deficits in adaptive behavior, and manifested during the developmental period that adversely affects a child's educational performance. So what stands out here is that they are children with a below average intellect, and their functioning, their day-to-day adaptive behavior or functioning is affected, and all of this occurs in their developmental age period. But we also have some professional organizations that provide us with other definitions as well. And the American Association on Mental Retardation, which now changed its name to the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, so AAID, to keep with the current practices and politically correct language. But they provide us a definition, and they say that children with this disability are characterized by intellectual and adaptive behavioral limitations that occur before 18 years of age. They must be assessed in environments typical for age and culture, must consider cultural, linguistic, communication, and sensory factors, must consider strengths as well as the child's limitations. The purpose of describing limitations is to develop supports for the child, and appropriate personalized supports will over time improve the life functioning of the individual with intellectual disabilities. So, how many children do we have in this category? Well, we don't know. It's pretty hard to gauge because there's such a range from more mild levels to severe. And there's also very little research that has been done on the differences between gender, sexes. However, there is a disproportionate representation of African American males, particularly in the more mild to moderate intellectual disability category. Some causes of intellectual disability, most actually are unknown. We're still doing a lot of studying, but we can break down into the before birth, the during the birth, and the after birth. So before birth, we have chromosomal abnormalities such as Down syndrome and fetal alcohol syndrome. During the birthing process, we can have children that are prematurely birthed, have a very low birth weight, or lose oxygen during the birthing process. And after birth, due to accidents or illnesses such as encephalitis or brain injury. So cognitively, what do these children look like? Well, they may have difficulties certainly with their memory, a lot of difficulty generalizing skills, so you might see that they can do a skill in one setting, such as add up coins, but when you get them into the community to a store, they may have difficulty. Metacognition, that means we think about our thinking, or we can problem solve. Problems with motivation, communication, and academics. The social characteristics of children with intellectual disabilities, they might be rejected by peers because they might come off much more immature by a number of age differences. So, for example, a child that is a peer group with 8-year-olds, this child might act more like a 4-year-old. They have inappropriate responses in social situations potentially, and difficulty understanding our nonverbal and verbal social cues. One of the part of the definition refers to adaptive behavior, and what that means is all of those things we need to function on a day-to-day basis. So they might have deficits in their self-care, hygiene, their social skills, their communication, leisure activities, work, community, health and safety. They might not know how to cross the street well, home living, and functional academics, those kind of academics that we need to function day to day. Identifying intellectual disabilities, we assess certainly using IQ and achievement tests. We assess their adaptive behavior, so their daily living skills, and there are scales that we use to do that. And we also assess medical factors. So how do we determine if a child's eligible for special ed? So we have to look at, does the student's IQ fall at least 2 standard deviations below the mean on the bell-shaped curve? Does the student have deficits in adaptive behavior? And is there an adverse effect on the student's educational performance? So we look at IQ, adaptive behavior, and it has to rise to the level where the child's education is impacted. In early childhood, many of these children receive birth 0 to 2 services in the home, as well as ages 3 to 5 in the preschool. Services are family-oriented, and also at this time we're stressing child development. At the elementary and secondary school levels, students are entitled to receive education in their least restrictive environment. Most students receive services in a special education setting, so they might be more segregated at times than others. The extent of their participation in the general education depends on their present level of functioning, and many options for classroom supports are available. So in terms of instructional placement and curriculum, a lot of times children will be included, particularly at the elementary level, in the general ed curriculum, but they also may start to receive more life skills curriculum, so really addressing functional academics and community-based instruction, particularly at the secondary level. For inclusion, again, this is determined on a case-by-case basis. A lot of these children are included at different times, maybe for part of the day. And schools need to provide a continuum of supports and placements. Transition, we must by law, by the age of 16, have a transition plan as part of the child's individualized education plan. And we are really looking at what happens to the child after school, after their high school years. But really a lot of what we focus on for children with intellectual disabilities is that we look to high school, even by preschool. In other words, we're already programming for the child to leave the school setting, because we need to make sure that the children become as independent as possible or continue to get the supports they need throughout their lives. Recommended practices, we're breaking down things, our instruction, into very small steps and teaching each step to the child. That's referred to as task analysis. And peer-mediated instruction, we're using peer groups and cooperative learning. Parents of children with intellectual disabilities will all be different because all families are different. There'll be different levels of experiences and acceptance, different concerns, and different types of interactions with professionals. What are the trends and issues related to this population? Should students with intellectual disabilities participate in high-stakes testing? A lot of our students will participate in alternative state testing. And how do we effectively foster self-determination in students with intellectual disabilities? And that concludes Chapter 8.